Well, hello everyone, welcome to my second ever video on this channel, Simon Talks Music. Today I'm reviewing 10 albums in short form. As always, this is all just my personal opinion. None of this is meant to be mean or anything like that. I'm just sharing how I personally feel about these albums. And, yeah, I know this video is still a little bit messy. Hopefully it's better than the first one, but I know it's still not the highest quality video. I'm gonna look back at it in the future and cringe, but anyway, with all that being said, let's get right into the reviews, starting with... So here's a new post-punk quartet formed in New York who recently released their debut studio album, and I'd never heard of them until just recently when this came out. And this seemed to be getting mostly positive reviews, which definitely made me excited to hear this, as someone who is a fan of post-punk. It's probably one of my favorite genres. And I absolutely get why this is getting so much acclaim, because this might be one of the most unique punk albums that I have heard all year. For one, the groovy instrumentation is a ton of fun. And here's where I would often point out that I wish the percussion would have a little more punch to it, because this isn't the sort of punk album that gives you loud, booming, crushing drums. Rather, a much softer drum sound, which often doesn't really fit in this sound. And yet here I actually really think it works to ramp up that tension in the grooves. I mean, a song like Simulation is a great example of that, with the vocals that sound slightly off pitch, although it may just be my imagination. Either way, I think it sounds really good. And the feeling of unease in this instrumentation and the drums, they go really well together with the quirkiness of the distorted guitars. And then you get a song like Girls Don't Try, where the spooky synths in the background let the subtle percussion not feel as big a deal, as it cunningly provides a grittier sound to this weird, messy, almost interlude-like piece in the middle of this record. And speaking of the synths, there's a lot of great synth work across this album. There's the 80s groove of the opening track, the eerie Halloween-like synths of Girls Don't Try, and those awesome groovy distorted synths in Ah, I Don't Wanna Go, which pair super well with the clicking percussion. And this album feels really experimental too, not falling into the stereotypical post-punk paths in the arrangements. And I think a great example of this is Hysteria, which has some of the most interesting vocals on this album, and terrifying instrumentation with the contrasting melody in the background giving this a much more raucous tone, and that shuffling percussion is spooky as hell. And I really like what cumgirl8 are doing lyrically on this album as well. There's a lot of social commentary on this album, and while political lyrics are always something I feel hesitant to discuss in detail considering my, let's just say, less than ideal level of political knowledge, there are some really striking moments on this album, I will say that, such as in the opener Karma Police, which I expected to be a Radiohead cover, but it isn't, and instead is a raging rocker which not only has the great line, "Fuck, our flight's tomorrow. Police, can you help?" Of course the police wouldn't help. But I also really like how, as far as I can tell, it's a song showing the narrator being overly hard on herself and suffering consequences before having a realization that other people are actually the problem. And that's when things start to take a turn from the better, with the flip of "I'm gonna vomit all over my face" with the switch from my to your in the bridge. And there's also Simulation, which to me feels like a positive take on the idea that everything is a simulation, with what I think might be an acknowledgement that everything could be a real simulation. I mean, whether or not this is all a simulation or if it's real life, really, what's the difference between the two? And I really like the line, "We're living in a simulation, a conversation with yourself." Yeah, I guess it could be interpreted as solipsist, which gets into very dicey territory, but I personally interpret it more as flipping that idea on its head. We're all real, but our own reality is all that we'll ever see. And the same goes for everybody else. And there's also the closing track, in which it doesn't feel totally clear whether she's talking to herself or her partner about whether or not to continue the relationship. The pissed off energy of "ah, I don't want to go" really fits with the musical vibe, including that awesome scream. And while UTI is definitely my least favorite track here, I do have to at least admire the uniqueness of it. And oh, I should also mention one of my favorite lyrics from this record, from the track Mercy. "Sexting with no encounter is the definition of the 21st." Honestly, that whole track lyrically is really strong, with that sense of being on the verge of a mental breakthrough to happiness, and yet the narrator doesn't seem to be able to figure out what that is. And there seems to be acknowledgement that, at least in certain moments, that feeling that that breakthrough is close can be really magical, even when on paper everything feels so dull. And by the way, the guitar on that track is pure post-punk magic. Unfortunately, there are some moments that feel like they should hit a lot harder, such as the opening track, which I wish had a little more breathing room in the production, and a couple of tracks toward the end don't really feel as memorable as the majority of this record. But still, there's so much packed into this short album that's under 40 minutes, and I definitely think cumgirl8 are a band to watch. This is some very experimental post-punk, which I think really stands out in the grander scheme of rock records I've heard this year, and fittingly this album is getting an 8 out of 10 from me. No, that wasn't done intentionally. But anyway, I highly recommend giving this album a shot. It's really something special. So I had definitely heard of this death metal slash ambient band quite a few times before this album came out, but I didn't really know much about them. And yes, I said they're a death metal slash ambient band, which is pretty much the only thing I knew about them going into this review. And I didn't realize just how much critical acclaim they've gotten, but their previous two albums were very well received by critics. By the way, I'm not including 2022's Time Wave Zero, which I haven't listened to yet. I'm not sure if it's officially an album or an EP. But I gotta say, as someone who doesn't really like death metal, I can't say they really did much for me when I listened to those two albums recently. Maybe I just need to give them more time and attention, but I just wasn't really wowed. But I was very curious about this new album, considering it's among the most critically acclaimed albums of 2024, regardless of genre. But I also had my slight doubts, considering that once again, I'm not really a huge fan of death metal, and I don't really think combining it with ambient music is really going to make me a huge fan. It didn't on their first two albums, although I think they showed some significant improvement here. The opening track really intrigued me, as it's basically a black metal track, and while it's definitely far from the most creative I've heard in the genre, it does have some real punch to it with the growling vocals and the incredible drumming, even though the drums sound a little awkward given the overall production sound. The drums just sound a little underpowered, and the snare sometimes feels a little overused. But again, the drumming on this track is really impressive, and it would probably be excellent live. Now, the second track features a sample from the 1980 film Contamination, and while I haven't seen that movie and thus I don't really know the context, I do really like the sound of this track with a really nice synth timbre, and then that prog rock section at the end really brings the song up a level, with the dramatic keyboards and great drum fills before that delicious guitar melody, and the culmination in the form of a death metal section at the end is a rare example of death metal really clicking for me. But then the third track has a really overpowering kick drum, and its mix of death metal and black metal doesn't really work at all in my opinion, especially with the annoying vocals, which feel really forced, and the super obnoxious busy drumming, and like I said, it's mostly the kick which bugs me here. And I like the philosophical lyrics on the fourth track that tries to untangle why we're all where we are. And it seems to have a sort of whatever attitude to the whole thing, which I really respect, even though I don't find the lyrics all that unique. And the song sounds pretty decent too, but it just didn't really stand out as much as the first two tracks. But then there's the penultimate track, which doesn't have a lot of lyrics, but it's still some pretty solid prog rock slash psychedelic rock, which sounds borderline Pink Floyd-esque at points. And honestly, the simplicity, a few words which have a lot of power in the context of the song, really feels reminiscent of the Dark Side of the Moon. And I mean that as a compliment, even though I think that album is overrated as fuck. And then I like how the closing track asks the audience to think about what positive impact you can have in the world without doing too much to the point where it destroys you mentally. And it's a nice way to end an album full of existential worries, with the question of how much everything really matters. And typically that sort of borderline nihilism doesn't sit well with me, but here I think to go along with the message of not to worry too much about being as good as you can be, I think it mostly fits. It doesn't really feel like nihilism, more just accepting that we can't always fix everything, and while it's often worth it to try, that's not always the case. Look, I don't think this is the most consistent album sonically, and the lyrics do feel kinda generic at points, which I think is a big part of what's keeping me from calling this album great, in my personal opinion. But I do think this was a pretty impressive showing from Blood Incantation, and you know what? It might actually have a decent amount of replay value for me too, we'll have to see. But for now, I'll give this a 7.5 out of 10. I think for fans of death metal, this will probably hit a lot harder, although maybe that's not really a good assumption to make considering all the variety of genres across this album. But it's really not what I was expecting at all, and while I don't quite love it as a full album, I like it a lot and I understand the hype. I definitely recommend this, at least to fans of metal. This is the second studio album from Orla Gartland, an artist who I was first introduced to in 2021 with her debut studio album, Woman on the Internet. And the biggest thing that stood out to me on that record was how Orla Gartland wrote variations of pop music cliches in the lyrics, with the sort of bold honesty that felt really noteworthy compared to so much deep music, most of which doesn't really have a lot to offer despite becoming massively popular. And for the most part, the production and instrumentation on that album were there too, leading to a really good album. Yeah, I wish more of the hooks stood out, but especially considering how good the vocals on that album are, I was really excited to hear this new album. And unfortunately, to me, this feels like the definition of a sophomore slump. And the biggest, most notable step down, in my opinion, here is the lyrics. Seriously, what happened here? Woman on the Internet had so much commentary all surrounding the narrator's apparent loss of direction, where the detailed writing really let the messy emotions shine through, where the message of a lot of the songs isn't totally clear because of how complicated morals are, and how complicated even finding the most satisfaction for yourself is, where the desire for attention, the idolization of others, and the self-awareness of it all are met with more questions than answers, and I think Orla Gartland really succeeded with that writing style on that album. But here, the lyrics feel a lot less interesting. Yes, there are moments that I really like. Mine is a song about something Orla experienced personally, and sadly, based on the lyrics, it seems like it may have been sexual abuse. And as heartbreaking as these lyrics are, there's also a message of self-love, which really shines through at the end of the track. And even though I don't personally love this track, mostly because I find it really boring sonically, I do have a lot of respect for it. And there's also Little Chaos, which is one of the few tracks here which reminds me of her debut album lyrically, with the sentiment of her wanting someone who will accept her as she is, which involves a little chaos. But the emphasis is on a little, because nobody's perfect, and sometimes just a little chaos can be a good thing anyway. And Late to the Party has the sort of bold honesty that I really do like, similarly to her debut album, with some creative phrasing such as feeling late to the party considering her partner's long list of exes, and expressing desire to meet the most recent of said exes, even though it's most likely completely unnecessary. But outside of a few moments, the majority of the lyrics on this album just feel a lot less interesting, and are lacking the personality in the writing that made Orla Gartland such a unique artist. Because here we get songs like Sound of Letting Go, which feels like another breakup song about moving on, which has a good message to it, but really doesn't feel like anything I haven't heard before. And then there's the lovey-dovey lyrics with the desire for commitment on Kiss Your Face Forever, and I think the title of that song is probably all you need to know to get a sense for what the song is like lyrically. And while Who Am I is about a one-sided relationship, unfortunately it doesn't really feel like it has a lot to say, before eventually revealing one of the worst lines on the entire album: "When you get sad, I find it all consuming. So why don't you just not get sad?" I mean, yeah, good on you for calling out your partner's selfishness, but is that really the way to do so? Oh, and I haven't even mentioned Simple, which might be the worst track here lyrically, with the endless list of comparisons to a relationship which don't make any sense at all, such as, "It's like a long flight but with good food." I mean, even putting aside my personal dislike of flying, this is pure cringe, and there are so many of these throughout the song. And unfortunately, I don't really like this album much sonically either. A lot of the guitars feel underpowered in tracks like the overly hollow sounding Little Chaos, and the failed attempt at funk in 3 Words Away. There's also a lot of annoyingly clunky drums all across this album, most notably in tracks like Little Chaos, Sound of Letting Go, and Simple, although it's an issue on most of the album. And that's not to mention a song like Kiss Your Face Forever, where I wish the drums had more punch, especially because the guitar and bass on that track are surprisingly powerful. Orla Gartland actually made a full-on post-punk song here, and I think there was some potential. And continuing on a positive note, the Declan McKenna collab Late to the Party has drums that are actually punchy and snappy, with some cool beat switches and a pretty strong guitar groove, which leads to probably my favorite song on this album. But outside of a few moments where it feels a little more experimental, a lot of this album just feels generic and lacking in pretty much everything that made her debut album as good as it is. And the more you listen to this album, the more obvious the Chappelle Rowan influence becomes. And as someone who still hasn't fully gotten aboard the Chappelle Rowan hype train, that's not really a good thing in my books. I mean, Backseat Driver reminds me of some of the moments from The Rise and Fall of a Midwest Princess, with the over-the-top attempt to be quirky, and the title track from this album feels like it pulled its melody straight from Hot to Go. So all things considered, unfortunately I think this is a very mediocre album. Yeah, it's got a few redeeming moments, which keep this from completely falling flat on its face, but I really don't think you're missing out on much if you skip this album. I definitely recommend her debut over this any day. There were at least some great songs on it, even though I didn't love the full album. Meanwhile, for me, this is a 5 out of 10. I really thought I was going to like this a lot more than I do. So I'll admit, I still haven't fully done the full Radiohead discography deep dive that I've been wanting to do for a while now. Yeah, I started to earlier this year, but then I just got overwhelmed with lots of new albums that I wanted to review, and it wasn't long after that that I went into a long stretch over a few months where I barely felt like listening to any music that was new to me, and I basically just listened to stuff I already knew. Specifically a small handful of songs and albums, and that was about it. It was a weird few months for me, don't ask questions. Anyway, The Smile, as many of you probably know, are a Radiohead spin-off featuring two members of Radiohead, Tom York and Jonny Greenwood, as well as Tom Skinner. And I didn't really love either of their first two albums, despite the massive amount of critical acclaim, but I was hearing really good things about this album too, and I will at least say it's probably my favorite album by The Smile so far. And a big part of that is because of the production, which really helps enhance the moodiness of some of these tracks, with a lot of really nice guitar timbres which fit really well in the mix. I mean, take a song like Colors Fly, for example, where the strings and horns really wash over the guitar without taking away from the in-your-face catchiness of that guitar melody. And especially with such good drumming, which also sounds great in the mix, it leads to one of the best songs on the album. Honestly, this track reminds me a little bit of the National Anthem by Radiohead from Kid A, in the bass line and the noisiness of the final leg, and I mean that as a huge compliment. It doesn't feel like a complete retread, but instead more of a unique take on a formula which has worked in the past. And back on the topic of the drumming, it's really impressive throughout this album. I'm a drummer myself, and I'm in awe of the energy that Tom Skinner brings to these songs, with a track like The Slip showcasing some real punchiness in the drumming which helps the guitar melody stand out more. And there's also Eyes and Mouth, which could have been a mellow Radiohead-like song, but instead it's really fun and groovy, mostly because of the great intense drumming. And while I'm not going to pretend that this album has Tom York's best vocal performances, this is Tom York we're talking about. He's a phenomenal singer, and that hasn't changed one bit on this album. And also, I like his Bono impression more than I would have expected on The Slip. And then there's the lyrics, which seem to show a lot of skepticism and fear, but also pacifies it with a sense of comfort. I mean, look at Zero Sum, where the system will provide may be meant satirically, and this song seems to partially be about global warming, but there does seem to be a sense of hope as well, that maybe humanity will make positive change, despite all the overconfidence that some people do have. And I also really like how Don't Get Me Started shows the narrator claiming to not be the villain, but there's a real sense of fear in the way that song sounds, which implies he may not succeed in convincing whoever he's speaking to. And I think it's a really fascinating moment on the album, where the collocation of calmness and anxiety shows someone else being the skeptic, and yet the narrator's feelings are somewhat the same as they've been throughout the rest of the record. And look, unfortunately the melodies aren't really as strong as I'd like them to be, and some moments here do feel a little underwhelming musically. Like, I wish there was just a little more detail in the production and arrangements to really give these songs a clearer mood. Although I can also see it may have been intentional, considering the contrasting emotions all over this album. And look, as always, my lyrical interpretations here are very likely wrong, but it's still fun to analyze, and I think this is a pretty fascinating album lyrically, and I mostly like it musically as well. It's kind of what you'd expect from The Smile, but I personally found it a little more interesting than their first two records. So 7 out of 10 for me, really good stuff. So I'll admit, I was not looking forward to reviewing this album. And the reason why is plain and simple. I don't know how to talk about Israel versus Palestine. I really don't know enough about the whole conflict that I can really have an opinion on it, and I've realized that I'm in a position where, as much as a part of me would love to just ignore it and go on about my life completely oblivious to this harsh reality, I mean, that would make my life a lot happier and joyful, but at the same time, I don't want to be ignorant, and like most people in a similar position that I'm in here, I feel like I want to do my small part to help, and yet I feel kind of powerless when I'm so unbelievably uneducated. Honestly, that's my stance on a lot of things, as much as I hate to admit it. And thus, I have started reading a little bit about the history of Israel versus Palestine. But I still have a long ways to go before I'm even close to having enough knowledge about it to be able to speak on it without all these asterisks I'm putting on every word that I say. With all this being said, it should go without saying that I obviously don't approve of the Gaza genocide, and I'm desperately hoping for a ceasefire. And sadly, that number in the album's title has only gone up, and that's not even including those killed by starvation and other indirect causes such as being buried under rubble and not having access to the right health care. And thus reviewing this album in a typical album review form just doesn't quite feel right. I think I've made it clear up to this point that I'm not really the right person to discuss the thematic aspects of this album, although, look, I hate to be that guy, but the issue I've had with Godspeed You, Black Emperor after finally listening through all their previous albums recently, which was long overdue, when there isn't much lyrical content, I have a hard time really taking in their messages as part of the album itself. It kind of feels like more of a separate thing. And that sort of thing has never really appealed to me much in music. It's kind of the main reason why I wasn't nearly as huge on that Underscores album from last year, where I can respect the well thought out concept. When it's not directly in the album's lyrics, I have a harder time praising it as an album, even though I get the appeal and can appreciate it as well written art. Now, with that being said, Godspeed You Black Emperor are one of the acts in that vein where for me it works a little bit more, although that can only get you so far with me. And it might be hypocritical of me considering how many black metal albums I love because of the lyrics, where I can't hear them because, well, metal vocals. And that's a completely different conversation because they are in the album itself, but really I'm getting ahead of myself here. And really, what I want to say right now is no, I'm not doing a typical review for this album. I absolutely respect what Godspeed You Black Emperor are doing here. In their statement about the album, they seem to question how much impact art really has in bringing positive change, or to put it in their words, what gestures make sense while tiny bodies fall. I mean, whether or not this album has any positive impact, I do have to give the band props for at least an attempt at making positive change and using their platform well. But also, I'm not going to pretend that the music itself is really having much of an impact on me personally. And really, it would be very fitting for me to not rate this album. I can't think of one famous music reviewer who didn't give it a score, and that's completely valid. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit too attached to my own rules, so just know that the 5 out of 10 attached to this review is not what I want you to focus on. This is barely even an album review at all. I don't even know what else to say. Alright, so in preparation for this review, I finally went through the rest of Coldplay's discography, from their classic rock records such as Parachutes and A Rush of Blood to the Head, to their more recent pop albums, and unfortunately, I think they've been getting worse and worse with nearly every new album they've put out. I think A Rush of Blood to the Head is probably my favorite album of theirs, but nearly everything since Viva La Vida or Death of All His Friends has been mediocre at best in my opinion, with the exception of the occasional strong single. And really, to me, Coldplay are more of a singles band than an album band. I like most of their hit songs, but the albums just don't really do a whole lot for me. But then there was 2021's Music of the Spheres, an album that completely baffled me with how mind-numbingly bad it is. It seemed like Coldplay was trying to make some sort of larger conceptual statement with an out-of-this-world album that ended up sounding like the most generic pop album possible, with the exception of a few particularly embarrassing moments. So that brought my expectations way down for this new album. But it's gotta be at least an improvement, right? And it is, but considering the extremely low bar the band set with their 2021 release, I don't really think the fact this is an improvement is saying all that much. And really, this is pretty much what I would have expected from a new Coldplay album. They're not trying to showcase some sort of huge beyond-this-world concept like they did on their previous album, at least not as far as I can tell, and thus this album is a lot less embarrassing. But it also doesn't have the same lyrical creativity or poetic aspects of their early work, and unfortunately it falls into the category of an album that feels like it has no identity. And honestly, considering the similarity in the title and artwork of their 2021 album, it did have me a little worried this was going to be more of the same. And here, at least we got a few decent hooks, like in Feels Like I'm Falling in Love, and especially I Am, which has a really nice acoustic guitar timbre, which sounds clean as fuck in the mix, and is a pretty close to great song. And even some of the cheesier moments aren't nearly as insufferable as they were on Music of the Spheres. Yeah, Good Feelings kind of sounds like Bastille with all the weird pitch shifting and bouncy pop groove, and Chris Martin's vocal delivery reminds me a bit too much of Dan Smith, but I can't deny it's basically a better version of My Universe. And none of these tracks are nearly as horrendous as Beautiful. But unfortunately, looking beyond all that, this album really doesn't have a whole lot to offer in my opinion. I think the production and mixing is generally decent, but when you don't really have much to work with, aka you don't have particularly strong hooks and compositions, it's hard for that to really shine through. And that's not to ignore moments like the Rainbow Emoji song, Alien Hits, Alien Radio, where the synths sound disgustingly metallic and the spacey vibe of the production completely sucks you into its world of discontentment through the sound alone, and it's arguably the worst song on this album. Again, not as bad as the worst moments on Music of the Spheres, but that's not particularly high praise when the worst moments of Music of the Spheres are, "And you're so beautiful." Anyway, while there are positive messages on this album, I really don't think the lyrics are worth analyzing all that much. As far as I can tell, it's all very surface level, with lyrics about a hope for positive change, and being there for people you care about, and loving everyone for who they are. And yeah, it's good messages, but it's nothing you haven't heard before. And honestly, I do think the instrumentation does at least a somewhat good job of backing up the lyrical sentiments, but it's really not enough in my opinion. Because when the fundamentals have so little to them that would make this at all memorable, a few good elements doesn't make for a particularly noteworthy album. Because it's not like there's anything here that really feels all that special or makes me feel like going back to this anytime soon. So I'm just gonna have to give this a light 5 out of 10. I mean, if you love Coldplay, you might like this. In that case, you've probably already heard it. But as someone who's never even been a huge Coldplay fan, even I can admit they've done way better. I'll call it a little bit better than I expected, but not by much. So for those of you who don't know, Jordy Griep is the former lead singer of Black Midi, an extremely critically acclaimed progressive rock band who went on an indefinite hiatus this past summer, and Jordy has been getting a massive amount of critical acclaim for his new album, arguably more than any Black Midi album, maybe more than any other album this year, except for that Magdalena Bay album, which, don't worry, I will get to reviewing that soon. And I can't pretend my expectations for this album were particularly high, despite all the acclaim. And that's mostly because I've never really been the biggest Black Midi fan. Yeah, back in the days when I was starting Simon Talks Music, I praised their music a lot, but that was still when I was discovering my taste in music. I mean, I still am, but you know what I mean. And I haven't really gone back to their music much, until recently when I re-listened to all 3 of their albums, and unfortunately, while I can respect the impressiveness of the vocals and instrumentation, it really doesn't connect for me emotionally, and there are enough nitpicks I have that make it hard for me to fully get into their albums. But considering how much acclaim this was getting, I definitely wasn't going to skip over it. And like I would expect from any album by Black Midi's lead singer, this album is a lot to take in. There's a lot going on, and it's hard to keep up with. And as I expected, it's got lots of guttural vocals. At least that's the way it sounds. I'm not sure if they're actually guttural vocals. I'm not very knowledgeable about singing. But either way, Jordy Griep's vocals are instantly recognizable, and honestly, this album mostly sounds like a Black Midi record, which makes sense considering their drummer Morgan Simpson plays the drums on 3 of these tracks, and some of these songs were initially going to be Black Midi songs. And unfortunately, I don't totally think it works. I already mentioned not being the biggest Black Midi fan, and I think my dad summed it up perfectly when he talked about them. I don't really feel their music. Yeah, it's impressive, and I can admire it, but it doesn't really do a whole lot for me beyond that. And that's once again an issue for me on this album, although while Black Midi albums usually have more catchy guitar moments and drumming that stood out to me more, here a lot of this just doesn't feel nearly as experimental, and some of the musical elements feel a little bit out of place, like that oily synth with way too much presence in the mix of Holy Holy, or the overly loud booming drums of the Magician, which doesn't fit the style of noise rock at all in my opinion. Sometimes the repetition is kind of funny in a charming way, such as on the opening track Blues with the snarling, listen, 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 listen. And I won't deny Jordy Griep has a unique presence behind the mic, and I do really like that about this album too. But there are also some strange interlude tracks which kind of throw off the pacing of the record, including Motorbike, which is sung by producer Seth Evans, which I'm not against as an idea, but it feels out of place considering the story going on throughout the album with its main character. And besides, I don't think it's a particularly strong track anyway, without particularly strong melodies, and while the instrumentation is impressive, it just sounds like a leftover Black Midi song. But on the topic of the story, the lyrics on this album are definitely supposed to be a lot to take in. And like with a Black Midi album, it's not easy to follow along with. There's very clearly a story here of a man who wants to be seen as bigger than everyone else, metaphorically speaking. And the sexual frustration is a huge part of this album, where he uses prostitutes for sex only to end up actually falling for one of them who he can't have. And this album really brings up the idea of sex as a feeling of achievement that makes one feel bigger and more important, and it definitely doesn't show that in a positive light, at least in this case where the narrator falls way too far down that rabbit hole, and it becomes a serious problem for many reasons. And unfortunately, despite all the weird-ass one-liners across this album, most of which just feel corny and random, maybe this is just me not looking into this deeply enough, but it just feels like it doesn't really have all that much to say. It feels like a concept album that's been done a million times in music before, and while there's more specific detail mentioned here, I personally don't find it all that captivating. Although at least it ends really well with a great cover of a Frank Sinatra song, which might actually be the biggest highlight on the album for me. Look, I know this might ruin my reputation as a music critic, but in my honest opinion, this album is a strong 6 out of 10. At least based on my personal taste in music. Obviously, it's subjective, it's subjective, not objective. And if you love Black Midi, there's a good chance you'll love this as well. But I can't help but feel like it's a major step down, and I really just had a hard time getting into this album. It's just not for me at all. This is the seventh studio album from the producer Dextro, which is the stage name of Ewan McKenzie, who is mostly known for making ambient music, although some moments on his albums can get kind of intense. And I recently listened to his first 6 albums in preparation for this review of his 7th album. Albeit, I just listened to them in the background, and I only listened to them once each. I don't have time to listen to every album by every artist I review multiple times. I try to get to as many as I can, but I also have a life outside of my reviews. But anyway, my overall feelings on those albums were mostly positive. His first 2 were just decent, but I really liked his next 4, and I was curious about this new album as well. I didn't expect to love it, but I was expecting some solid ambient music. And like with all instrumental albums, I obviously can't make this review about the lyrics, obviously, but I can still be pretentious and overanalyze the meaning of it. And of course, it's always hard to tell whether or not there's a deeper meaning or message in an instrumental ambient album. But here, the best way I can describe it is it's a subtle sense of imminent doom throughout the record. By the time it gets to Glitter Machine, with those haunting piano melodies and the tension created by the distorted sounds, it starts to really feel like the album is going to go downhill from there. Not in terms of quality, but in terms of the mood of the record. And then the second to last track kind of feels like a soundtrack to a moment in time when you know things are about to go wrong, but it hasn't happened yet. I honestly wonder if this represents someone's life coming to an end, and they realize they have little time left, and this track is really haunting. And then the closing track leaves it even more up to interpretation, without a real sense of conclusion, but without a dramatic cliffhanger either. Really, it's hard to describe, but it's a really smart way to end the album, despite everything seemingly leading to an incredibly bleak, devastating conclusion. But all that aside, this album sounds really good. The production sounds cinematic at points, especially in a track like Autonomy Fantasy Annihilator. The percussion has a nice crisp sound to it, and I love how the strings gently swim across these soundscapes, and I really like the texture provided by the clean guitars as well. Yeah, I know I'm probably overthinking this album thematically. I mean, there's not really any way to be confident about what an album's deeper meaning is when there are no lyrics. But I just wanted to describe the imagery and feelings that this album brings to my mind. Look, I was expecting this to be pretty good, but I wasn't expecting to like this quite as much as I do. Because whatever this album represents, it certainly has an emotional core to it that really resonated with me. I already mentioned that I liked the album's ending, but I do wish the closing track had a little more to it, even though I think it conceptually makes a lot of sense. But I'm still going to give this an 8 out of 10. It doesn't work as well in terms of individual tracks, but I think as a whole album it might actually have some replay value. So in preparation for this review, I finally decided to listen through Katy Perry's entire discography, listening to each album a few times each. And honestly, I can't really call myself a Katy Perry fan at all. Yeah, there's the occasional good track, and I'm not sure she has a bad album, except maybe Witness. But for the most part, she's an artist who I think makes bland pop music without a lot to really make it stand out. But I saw this album getting super negative reviews, considered one of the worst albums of 2024 by lots of critics, and thus I was not looking forward to this album at all. And if she didn't have a bad album before, she definitely does now, because this album sucks. It baffles me that in 2024, an artist as popular as Katy Perry could release an album like this, which sounds like a parody of pop music, pointing out all the worst cliches in the genre, and all the worst elements of popular music, period. And it really seems like Katy wants us to take this seriously. I mean, do you really think the audience isn't going to cringe super hard at a song called Artificial, where the whole point is how everything's all artificial now, and this song has one of the most overproduced beats I've heard on a pop song recently. Oh, and of course there's a very noticeable effect on the word artificial, because this song is so self-aware. Anyway, the opening track, Woman's World, is by far the best song on this album. But that's only because this song is decent, and the rest of the album is so bad. But the combination of the bass and percussion on this track is actually pretty solid, and it has one of Katy's better vocal performances on this album. There are still flaws on this track. I think the lyrics are really generic, and I don't really like the ahhhs in the chorus. But it's an okay track. Then Gimme Gimme is a terrible song with a terrible feature from 21 Savage, who drops lines such as, "I'm like Amazon, 'cause I got what you need." And Katy Perry gives the song a terrible chorus that has a really odd vocal effect before saying, "Crawling on me like a centipede." And the whole song is a total mess that feels like the result of combining all the worst elements of pop music. Gorgeous, on the other hand, is a shitty Steal Your Man anthem with so many squeaky sounds in the instrumental that are obnoxious as fuck, and there are basically no redeeming qualities about this song, with neither singer having a very commanding presence here and the chorus sounding like it could be from any forgettable hit song from the 2010s. And then Katie tries rapping on I'm His, He's Mine, which I don't think sounds good at all, and that weird, warbly synth just goes on and on throughout the track and takes away from any sort of energy, and doesn't even lead to a nice laid back sound either. And Dochi's guest verse sounds incredibly phoned in. Crush is full of la-da-da-dee vocals over top of an instrumental with a relentless synth that has no muscle to it and just sounds like someone using the first synth sound that they could find online for free. And the track just sounds super overproduced and overly bouncy, which I really don't like in this sort of dance song. Truth could have used much better production than the generic trap beat that he uses, although that wouldn't have saved the song anyway because Katie's vocals are so goddamn processed that the emotional appeal of the song doesn't shine through at all. Although maybe there's a positive to that, because when you look at the lyrics, you see the narrator looking through her partner's phone and being a total dick. And while it's implied that the partner in the song was discovered to be cheating, it doesn't make the narrator's pushiness any less insufferable. And the album ends with Wonder, which is basically the blandest, least empowering empowerment anthem that you're going to find, at least to me, with all the whoa vocals, and the fact that the instrumental sounds more like the sort of thing you'd hear in an emotional nostalgia for the past song. Which is kind of what this is, but making it an empowerment anthem just doesn't work in my opinion. It just feels really pretentious, and the lyrics don't really have much to say. And any song that I didn't mention is really bad, but maybe with a couple redeeming qualities. But I've gone over the worst and best of this album, so here's a 2.5 out of 10 for me on this album. Even if you're a fan of Katy Perry's early music, if you haven't heard this, I highly recommend you don't. Honestly, I won't mince words. This is the worst album I've heard all year in 2024 that's new from this year. There isn't a single legitimately good track, and it might have multiple of the worst songs I've heard all year. I don't see any reason to give this a chance. In fact, I'm kind of wondering why I even did in the first place. Look, I know this review is harsh, but I personally think this album is really, really goddamn bad. This is terrible. This is the second studio album from this country singer whom I'd never heard of until recently, and I decided to check out her debut album from 2020. And I gave it a few listens before hearing this new album, and while the chilly vibe of the instrumentation and production had some real bite to it, for the most part the songwriting felt kind of cheesy at points, and it mostly just didn't really captivate me. It sounded like a very generic album for the most part, without a lot of standout melodies. I guess you could call it bedroom pop, which isn't really a genre I typically like much anyway. But this album has been getting more acclaim, and based on what I've seen online, it seemed like this was heading in more of a country direction. And as a fan of country music, I really wish I could say I like this album, but unfortunately I think it's a pretty noticeable step down from her debut. Most of it is because I don't think the atmosphere of this record is continued, or I don't think the atmosphere of that record is continued onto this record, with a much more direct sound, which in moments I think work here, but the overall sound is a bit too messy for it to really have the punch that I'd like. And it doesn't feel laid back enough to be a nice, mellow country album. And unfortunately, I'm not super impressed by the lyrics on this album, which is a problem for me that was very present on her debut, Mooth, as well. A lot of it just feels overly metaphorical or hyperbolic in a way that, personally, just, I don't really like it. I mean, maybe there's some sort of lyrical theme that ties this all together, and I'm just not realizing it, but it's just not really connecting for me. But, I mean, with that being said, there are a few moments lyrically that I really like, such as the chilly, haunting lyrics on Backyard Lover, which seems to be about the narrator wishing for a relationship, but not feeling any sort of motivation in the aftermath of losing a loved one. And it seems possibly tied to the track Foolish and Fast, which seems to be showing the narrator trying to move on from that loss, and the poetry is really strong and descriptive. And I'm well aware that I'm likely misinterpreting these songs, but I may as well point out these theories I have on it, whether or not they're accurate. But then you get some cornier moments, such as the opening line of Rain. This sounds like a song I barfed out in the drought. Strange line. And that's before that song continues to go on with a bunch of imagery, which to me just feels overly forced. And unfortunately, I'm not wowed by this sonically either. Yeah, she's a good singer, and the guitar has some snarl to it that I quite like, but unfortunately the vocal melodies just aren't really doing that much for me, and as a whole album, by the time I get to the end, I almost feel like it never happened. And I mean, it's not a bad album, it's just really forgettable to me, and I'm not sure there's a great song on it, at least to me. And there are also some moments like the closing track with overly airy sound that I don't like at all, or the utterly dull and lifeless Window. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something with this album, but I'm feeling underwhelmed by it. It's just not really for me. 5.5 out of 10. Alright, thanks so much for watching. The reviews were filmed a few days before this was filmed. I'm hoping to get this video out fairly soon after filming this, but we'll see. Anyway, I do have some individual album reviews coming up soon, including one for that new Magdalena Bay album. Like I mentioned, it's coming soon. I just have to finish writing it and then filming it, but hopefully that'll be before too long. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.